Trypophobia is defined as an aversion to the sight of repetitive patterns or clusters of small holes or bumps. And if you have it, this is not the iPhone case for you. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today I thought it's about time we give some credence to the absolute worst iPhone case Apple has ever made, that one silicon case for the iPhone 5C. Yeah, I mean, just look at it. Why is it designed this way? Who thought this was a good idea? And why do I kind of love it? To the point that a decade ago I had one on my own blue iPhone 5C just like this. And most importantly, why the heck did Apple think it was a good idea to design a case that turned your iPhone into a non-phone? Now mind you, there are some good qualities here too. Lots of colors to mix and match with, and the case itself feels quite premium with this soft microfiber lining on the inside, just like any modern silicon case from Apple. The build quality is solid, it feels great in the hand, and while the design is questionable at best, am I really justified in calling this the worst iPhone case ever? Well, to fully understand the sociological complexities of this matter, we should probably back up a little bit here.
From the beginning, we wanted to design cases as colorful and as well made as the iPhone itself. The result is a case that extends and complements the product while offering dozens of colorful combinations.
2013 was a pivotal year for Apple. Steve Jobs had passed away 2 years ago, leaving Tim Cook and Johnny Ive to fully take the reins for iPhone's direction moving forward. The change would be swift and drastic. The most obvious example of this would be iOS 7, which completely revamped the UI with a more flat but very colorful slew of icons, alongside plenty of transparency and slow but fancy animations. But the software can only be as impressive as the device it runs on, and so enter the iPhone 5S, Apple's latest and greatest flagship. With the power of hindsight, it's easy to say the 5S absolutely still stands as one of Apple's greatest iPhones. The design was the same as the iPhone 5, but with the addition of Touch ID, and most importantly, a new gold color, which people were frankly far too hyped for. The A7 chipset powering the 5S was also the first 64-bit processor in a smartphone, allowing the 5S to end up getting updates from iOS 7 all the way through iOS 12, a level of longevity that was unheard of for any mobile device of this era. But Apple wasn't done cooking. They had one more trick up their sleeve in the iPhone 5C, which, ironically enough, is often regarded as one of, if not the worst iPhones Apple has ever made. It certainly was a failure compared to their sales expectations anyways, and considering what it brought to the table, it's hard to find the low demand surprising. It was posited as Apple's supposed affordable option, coming in at only a paltry $100 less than the 5S, whilst packing the same internal hardware as the iPhone 5, all wrapped up in a polycarbonate plastic shell that, as sleek and impressive as it was, didn't exactly scream premium. A plastic iPhone at a time where Apple was specifically known for making more premium devices compared to the endless number of plastic Android phones on the market. Combine that with year-old hardware at the same price as the iPhone 5 would have been had it stuck around rather than being discontinued outright. And then you've got no Touch ID, which really stung given it was one of the most exciting features of the 5S. Even just having Touch ID on the iPhone 5C would have made it so much better value, and likely would have turned around the narrative completely, but that's not what happened. The 4S had seen a $100 price reduction in 2012 when the iPhone 5 came out, and this was the norm. So for the iPhone 5 to just disappear altogether, with the iPhone 5C taking its place at no added value, well, it's not hard to connect the dots on why the phone ultimately flopped. Even so, there is a lot I love about the iPhone 5C, and I myself purchased one refurbished off eBay back in, I believe, 2014. The design, the color, even just the feel in the hand. I maintain this is one of Apple's most comfortable phones to actually use, both because of the small size with that 4-inch Retina display, as well as the rounded, smooth, and glossy polycarbonate finish. It's difficult for a plastic smartphone to actually feel premium to the touch. Samsung liked their somewhat textured plastic as well as a chrome paint to try to give the impression of higher quality materials than what was actually being used, but the 5C didn't do this. It was straightforward in what it was. It was plastic, pure and simple. No fake metallic looking frame, just colorful, unabashed plastic. And talk about colorful. Where the 5S was breaking the norm for having a third color option, the 5C was running in pure contradistinction to how iPhone had always been postured. It didn't use premium materials, it was plastic. It didn't have only 2 or even 3 color options, but instead 5, and none of them were really normal colors outside of the white 5C. You were encouraged to purchase a phone maybe a bit out of your comfort zone at a time where not a whole lot of smartphone competitors, with higher end flagships at least, were doing this. The iPhone 5C was purposefully different in every possible way. It wasn't your mom and dad's iPhone, it was the iPhone of a new generation, the Pepsi over the Coke of old. Apple was aggressively pushing for a market they had never before considered, one that was more budget-oriented and would find such colors enticing. And for those who weren't bold enough to use a pink iPhone in public, well, white is always an option. Or, you know, pay an extra $100 and get the 5S, a far better phone in every conceivable way. The 5C only got from iOS 7 to iOS 10, and while like with the identical iPhone 5 it performs fine on iOS 10, certainly not unusable like the 4S on iOS 9 or just annoyingly slow like the 4 on iOS 7, you're still talking about an extra 2 years of updates for only $100 more. For added context, the 5S would cost you $650 for 16 gigs off contract, whereas the 5C was $550 also at 16 gigs. Apple later on would have an 8GB 5C, which was a terrible phone with way too little storage, but that's besides the point. The 5S being only approximately 15% more expensive than the 5C made the plastic device seem like an absolute joke, and as a result, we had Apple failing to meet anywhere near sales expectations. But that doesn't mean the phone didn't sell at all. In fact, it was one of the best-selling smartphones available, and for those of us who ended up purchasing one, whether brand new or secondhand, we were still left with a very good iPhone experience, because I mean, this basically was just an iPhone 5, and the iPhone 5 was awesome. So enter my 14-year-old self wanting to purchase a smartphone case for their new phone as someone who suffered from extreme Apple fanboyism. I still have the core memory of finding a brand new iPhone 5C case on a big discount at a closing Canadian Target, and so no doubt bolstered by a sense of pride from owning such a cool-looking iPhone, I made the brilliant decision to purchase the absolute worst case for any iPhone ever. Okay, I mean realistically, this isn't the worst case ever. I myself have certainly owned cases I would consider worse, either because they were just ugly or poorly built or both. I can think back to my first ever phone case on my iPhone 4, which was basically this thick, ugly OtterBox ripoff, which these things were like a dime a dozen in malls across the world. In fairness, that case was pretty thick and probably did a better job actually protecting the iPhone 4 from drops, but the iPhone 4 was also a far more fragile phone than the 5C thanks to the glass back, whereas here we have that seamless polycarbonate. I'm pretty sure there was a period of time where I didn't have any case for the 5C, and honestly I probably never needed one, but when an opportunity arose to get a sleek, thin, and definitely beautiful case made by Apple themselves on the cheap, how could I possibly say no? But as I was saying, this in actuality isn't the worst iPhone case ever, both in terms of quality or even protection. There are thousands of generic cheap smartphone cases out there that are undoubtedly far worse, but the key difference is those cases aren't made by massive companies like Apple. It would be more impactful if you had a poor case made by a better known brand like say OtterBox, but even then they're just a drop in the ocean compared to the size and scope of Apple themselves. So for them to make a case like this that's so out there in design, I mean, it's hard not to take notice, and of course the failure of an experiment like this is going to make a bigger splash than any random generic alternative case out there. It's like how the iPhone 5C is widely considered a failure despite outselling the vast majority of its competition by a massive margin. It's because the 5C was from Apple and didn't meet Apple's standards. And likewise, by the standard of Apple, the design of this case is not up to snuff whatsoever. But let's take a moment and look at this from the lens of 2013 and why Apple even made it like this in the first place.
The team has created a really cool line of custom cases specifically for the iPhone 5C. They're made of a soft feel silicone rubber. As we look down, you're going to see these cool circular cutout patterns. So you get this amazing combination of color between the iPhone 5C and its case. It's absolutely beautiful.
I struggle to think of any other time Apple has so closely intertwined showing off an accessory or a case for their iPhone as boldly or proudly as they did with the iPhone 5C and its special silicon case. Within barely a minute of the 5C even being announced, Phil Schiller was showing off this new case specifically tailor-made for the new phone. Making cases at all was actually sort of a new concept for Apple. They had done it before, like the bumper case for the iPhone 4 that helped to mitigate antennagate, but they were trying something new here, and on the 5S side, you had that beautiful leather case. I've actually got one. It came along with a used iPhone 5 running iOS 6 I had purchased off eBay years ago, and it's an amazing case. It feels so good in the hand. Apple's leather cases were always something special, and I loved getting them with my new iPhone every year until Apple decided to move to the just awful fine woven. And well, there's a reason Apple discontinued those cases only a year after they originally came out. You cannot buy them for the iPhone 16 or the 16 Pro, probably because nobody was buying them to begin with. They're really really not good. In fact, you might even say the fine woven cases are the truly worst iPhone cases ever made, and I think that would be a fair statement. But the design is at least normal, and they're certainly not as memorable as the 5C case. I would say the 5C case is more like the best worst case Apple has ever made. It shows an element of Apple being extremely experimental in their design, far more so than we're used to today. Though on the surface, I think I'm starting to understand what Apple was trying to go for. A window for the Apple logo was extremely common for any iPhone case around this time. It was practically a staple of phone case designs, since the idea was people wanted to show off the fact they were indeed using an iPhone, and the Apple logo was the easiest way to do that. Like iPod had been, iPhones were a fashion statement, something you wanted people to see and show off. A core philosophy of Apple has always been beautiful product design, making something that is gorgeous both inside and out, even without turning it on and actually using it. So with Apple moving their smartphone design in a new, fresh direction, it only made sense for them to make their own smartphone case specifically built to not just protect the phone, but enhance their aesthetic further. This idea was really good on paper, as Apple would encourage customers to mix and match colors with their own 5C, an expression of creativity and individuality completely out of the norm for a company that had always been so stiff with product uniformity. Their way to do this was not just to have a window for the Apple logo, but instead a bunch of holes for the colorful plastic of the 5C to peek through, along with the subtly imprinted Apple logo to let you know not only was this an iPhone, but an iPhone with a case made by Apple themselves. As an aside, all those cases that had the windows for the Apple logo, I think they were a mistake, since they tended to result in the phone's finish fading in a circle around the logo. My dad's old yellow iPhone 5C here, for example, you can tell pretty clearly he used to have an OtterBox that left the logo exposed. The paint or coating would also similarly fade around the camera. I'm not sure if this case specifically would result in the plastic fading in a similar way. It would probably be an amusing sight if so, with what would amount to a grid layout of faded polka dots along the bottom 2/3 of the phone. But I digress. What I want to get at is this idea of combining colors together and even having a case built specifically for the phone to enhance the overall experience. It was all really quite brilliant. While this specific case might be quite weird, Apple's experiment with the 5S's leather case would more than make up for it. It was built by Apple and it made your iPhone look better. So in theory, this case could have and should have been amazing. A bold fashion statement for the dozens of 5C users out there like myself. What could possibly go wrong? Well, a lot. Even a quick glance obviously tells us this case looks a bit silly, but that's something we could easily let slide were it not for a few problems. First, dirt and debris would get into these holes. I remember this happening, just like they did with the windows around the Apple logo or camera on other cases. Sort of inevitable if you're using a smartphone long term and not thinking to regularly take the case off to clean it, but still, that's a lot of holes for dirt to get into. One more thing I'll tack on to this point is that silicon can pick up dust really easily. Me having a white case doesn't really help with that, but the fact that the Apple logo is like physically imprinted in the case means that dust can catch on it really easily. You can see here, it's a minor issue all things considered, but worth noting. Secondly, you've got the iPhone wordmark and FCC labels on the bottom of the phone. While iPhones, at least in North America, haven't had these ugly warnings in a long time, they were very much around a decade ago, something Apple would purposely neglect to show in their keynote, by the way, and in reality, those labels are clearly visible through the grid of dots in the case, and it looks weird. But that element is nothing compared to the thing that was shown on the 5Cs in its own presentation, the iPhone wordmark. Slap this case on and you no longer own an iPhone, but instead a non-phone. Congratulations! This is without a doubt one of, if not the dumbest, most ridiculous, and incomprehensible decisions from any product Apple has ever designed. I am not exaggerating here. The fact that this supposedly beautiful smartphone case, made to enhance the colors of the 5C, managed to cut off part of the iPhone wordmark is insanely ridiculous and feels like a complete oversight. Like the design team just forgot altogether they had to take into account that at least a few of those letters would end up visible. And what really kills me here is in the presentation, while they do show the wordmark leaking through in the big advertisement they had, when Phil Schiller initially shows off the case, look, there's no wordmark. They just photoshopped it out. You probably didn't even notice this when I first showed this clip, did you? I sure didn't until watching this again and realizing, hey, there's no iPhone wordmark there. The case will never ever look this good on any actual iPhone 5C. It's like they realized how ridiculous it was, and so they did this sloppy fix that borderline amounts to false advertising, honestly. And it's such a a blatantly ugly blemish that completely ruins the whole thing. Imagine how much cleaner this would look without that word mark. It would actually look really cool. Is intentionally having holes in your smartphone case without any actual utility still an odd choice? Sure, but people spend hundreds of dollars for jeans with holes in them, so why not your $29 phone case? Like, it's not an exact analogy, but hopefully you understand what I'm getting at. The FCC labels being a necessity by law could be somewhat excused, but the whole non-phone debacle, for me, this is the exact issue that positions this iPhone case as the worst Apple has ever made by a long shot, at least in the way of design. If the word mark wasn't there, it would be different, but it's not like Apple was going to just remove it solely so their phone case would look a bit cleaner. And funnily enough, a case like this would probably work far better nowadays, sort of. Since 2019, the Apple logo has been centered and the iPhone word mark removed altogether. If I were to put my extremely professional and definitely not utterly amateur Photoshop skills to the test, an iPhone 5C would look like this if Apple made it today. Of course, the case would partially cover the Apple logo as it is now, so let's adjust it a bit, maybe put some dots above as well, and okay, low resolution image I'm working with and my own sloppiness aside, this is a monstrosity, I take it back. I really don't know if there's a way to make this case look good. It's funny, I do love this case. I love the grid layout of the circular cutouts, I love all the colors, I love that Apple knew their plastic 5C was already going to be fairly durable, and they were willing to experiment with their case rather than opting for something purely protective. But they missed the mark here. In the very least, this was a cheap case by modern standards. It was priced around $30 in 2013, which is about half of what a silicon case would run you today. If you want one for yourself, you can still find them brand new on eBay for under $10. Just make sure you're getting an authentic Apple one. Obviously, you can't show off your beautiful iPhone 5C with some knockoff piece of plastic. I think it's fair to say this isn't the worst iPhone case ever made, period, but I do think it's the worst from Apple. Fine Woven's up there too, but I'm gonna put this at the top for now. And it was a good lesson for them to learn. This was an era where there was a stark shift from Steve Jobs' conformity and rigid rules for design and products. An era where Apple went the complete opposite direction, and in doing so, too often put form over function, opting to have slow animations because they look nice, and having power-hungry transparency everywhere, instead of the fast, reliable, skeuomorphic consistency of old iOS. The fact that the iPhone 3GS on iOS 6 is faster than the iPhone 4 on iOS 7 is very telling for where Apple's priorities were in these days. The iPhone 5C is one of Apple's most interesting products ever made without any doubt, not only for the hardware itself, but even the case protecting it. And so I am glad we got to talk about it today. It's actually not the first time I've done a video on this case, believe it or not. The last one was like 6 years ago though, so I hope you forgive me. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more obscure iPhone case content. That's going to be my sole focus moving forward, is just every iPhone case ever, I'm thinking. Also, please make sure you comment down below, especially if you owned this case. I definitely want to hear your guys' thoughts on this one, because it's definitely divisive. Some people love this case, some people hate it, and I'm probably more on the love side, but I can recognize it's definitely flawed, to say in the very least. Huge shout out to the channel members for being absolutely amazing people, and thank you all so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.